Professor Márcio Medina, do Colégio Porto Seguro do Rio de Janeiro. Aqui no Brasil a gente vem treinando os alunos para resolver exercícios e não ensinando como a ciência funciona e o que é ciência. E eu vi muita coisa sobre alfabetização e tanto matemática, e não compreendi, não vi em nenhum momento falar sobre o ensino de ciência. Eu queria saber quais os processos da alfabetização científica são utilizados nesses moldes que vocês apresentaram.
So the question is really around the science education and how come, first of all, how come we didn't talk about that so much, and secondly, what it mean? So I actually think, and Rod, I think will have more specific answers on this, because what I've presented today, I think, is actually not bound by math or by literacy or by science. It's sort of a general set of principles for learning as we go forward in all subject matters. And so actually, if you look at my presentation, it doesn't have a lot about any subject at all, because that's just not my area of expertise. My sense, though, is that starting to understand some basic scientific facts is, people say, oh, facts don't matter. They do. You have to have a basic understanding of facts so that you can have basic conversations in the 21st century where science is going to be more and more important, not less important. And then secondarily, I think building in students' understanding of the scientific method and what the beauty of science actually is really critical so that they start to develop these. One of the things that I think is very exciting, there's a danger right now because we're going back to Khan Academy as examples a lot of times, so I apologize, it's just on my mind. But they developed a project-based learning schooling for science education. And what they actually did was, the experiment was to build a robot at the end. But the way that they constructed the curriculum was you actually had to go all the way back to the beginning of science to figure out what is matter. Like, if you're going to understand what energy is to power this robot, you ought to understand what matter is, right? Solids, liquids, gas, literally that basic. And they started to have you go through the actual experiments that the real scientists did throughout the last several hundred years in understanding this so that you could get a very fine-grained understanding as you progress to build your robot. So I think it's a critical part of this, but I don't think it's exempt from anything that we've talked about.
Yeah, I completely agree, Michael. In fact, I think science is a great example of how these 21st century competencies really, properly done, really weave in. I think for too long, we've thought of science as a body of facts to be learned. And so often our kids think, well, the science is all done, I just have to memorize it. And science, it has ceased to become a process or an activity, but it's become a body of facts to be learned. And so we know in Canada, and I think the US is the same, that students are not choosing sciences in universities as much as they used to. Not because, in my view, they can't, they're not smart enough, or we've killed science for them. We as educators have killed science. Science is experimentation, it's curiosity, it's asking questions. It's those kindergarten kids saying, why is grass green and the sky blue? Those are science questions. We change it somewhere along in how we teach it to teaching facts as opposed to teaching process. As Michael said, there still are facts involved, and you need to know a bunch of things, but students get bored learning those things unless they're connected to something that's meaningful and real to them. So we talk often about high-tech high, and one of the things that they talk about, or sort of a key phrase of theirs is we don't want our students learning to be a scientist. We want them to be a scientist. We don't want them learning to be a journalist. We want them to be journalists. So how is it you can have those really meaningful learning experiences for kids in the sciences, which really turns them on? When we have this conversation with the post-secondary world, the universities in British Columbia, they're in complete agreement. Most of them. They're mostly in agreement. There's a couple of crazy math guys. No, they're mostly in agreement. Because they would say, and my son is just graduated from university with a Bachelor of Science degree, but he was told in grade 11, don't worry about Science 10, we're going to teach you the real stuff now. And in grade 12, don't worry about what you learned in biology 11 or chemistry or physics, we'll teach you the real stuff. First year university, they could care less what his marks were, what science courses he took in high school. We're going to teach you the real stuff. And every year he kept waiting for the real stuff, and it never appeared. Because what they kept asking for was curiosity, grit, all those things that we're talking about more often as competencies than as content. So I think, though, with science, I'm going on way too long, our big question is going to be around assessment. Because it's far more difficult to assess those kinds of processes and questions and competencies than it is a 25-question multiple choice test. What's the third item on the periodic table? So a lot of our focus is around how we're going to assess those pieces.
One other quick thing that what you said made me think of in terms of the number of scientists and engineers having gone down in a lot of fully industrialized and prosperous countries. What's interesting, if you look at the rise of Japan in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, one of the popular explanations for their growth in the United States was that they were graduating 4 times the numbers of scientists and engineers as America with just a fraction of the population. And then an interesting thing happened, though, that when Japan hit prosperity about 1990, and prosperity has been relatively short and they've stagnated, the numbers of scientists and engineers coming from the top of the class has just gone down year over year over year. And our sense is that when Japan was escaping poverty, there was high extrinsic motivation to study science and engineering no matter how badly it was taught. Because that was your key to escape poverty. That was where the jobs were and how you got out. But once poverty was relatively assured, why do the hard work of studying science and engineering when you could do art history or something like that? And so I think the answer to these questions is we have to make the study of science and all these topics intrinsically motivating, interesting in and of themselves, which is why the student-centric framework, I think, is so important. And it's not just Japan that's had this. Korea, Singapore, country after country has had this, where they march up with lots of scientists and engineers, they get to a place of prosperity, and then systematically you see the numbers start to decline. And I think it just suggests we have to change the way teaching and learning occurs.
And I would just add one more thing, just because I love this topic, but the inclusion of ethics and values in science. Often we divorce those. We have math and science as sort of those are the pure things, and there's this muddy ethical values-laden world over here. I want our future scientists to have values and ethics. I want them to think very hard and carefully about the choices they're going to make, and I hope they're better than the ones my generation made. So I think it's, again, blending a bunch of those things together into real-life projects for kids around ecology and all, a whole variety of those kinds of things, because those are passions that kids have, they're value-laden, they're the kinds of worldviews we like in our young people to get us out of the fix we've put ourselves in. So science is sort of the old view of this pure piece of learning over here, I think is starting to shift as it gets blurrier.
Só para esclarecer, a High Tech High, que o Rod mencionou, é uma escola, hoje já um grupo de escolas dos Estados Unidos totalmente centrada em educação por projeto, aprendizagem por projeto, né? Eles não têm mais aulas convencionais. E o interessante desse modelo de poder explorar ciências é que, de fato, os alunos, eles encontram um problema que é um problema real e eles têm que solucionar esse problema. Então, a ciência, ela está a serviço da solução de um problema que eles enfrentam na escola, na comunidade, na vida deles. Então, faz todo o sentido eles investigarem. E as formas de investigação são as mais diversas. Inclusive, o Paulo Blixstein, né, ele fala muito da sala de aula invertida, duplamente invertida, em que os alunos deveriam, na verdade, começar experimentando para depois discutir e só então assistir uma aula onde eles vão sintetizar o aprendizado que eles já vivenciaram, né? Isso Para ciências funciona muito bem, mas eles têm feito na Hightech High isso com todas as disciplinas. Heloísa, você é a próxima. Se você pudesse se apresentar de novo, que eu...
Meu nome é Heloísa Mesquita, eu trabalho na Secretaria Municipal de Educação do Rio de Janeiro. É muito bom conhecer, a pergunta vai para o professor Rod Allen. É muito bom conhecer experiências de sucesso, mas eu gostaria também de conhecer, para aprender um pouco com as suas dificuldades que enfrentou. Então eu queria saber se você teve alguma resistência dos professores quando foram apresentadas as novidades, as inovações, o desejo de inovar, em enfrentar, por exemplo, uma greve de professores que não queriam aderir ao novo modelo.
Absolutely. When we began this conversation in the province, and government got engaged in it, not particularly me, but government got engaged in it, the teachers' union refused to participate and said, we're not talking to you guys, you're government. If it's your idea, it stinks, and we're not doing it. And it took, I had hair then, so it took a lot of hard work to really try to build trust that no one is trying to do anything to anyone else. We'd like to think of things collectively differently. So we were in a period of job action, not quite strikes, but job action, where teachers weren't going to any meetings when they started. And so we said, that's fine, but we just kept inviting them, and they kept coming. And the union went crazy. And then summertime came, and they said to us, please don't invite any teachers to come and work with you over the summer, because they'll come. And we said, well, that's great. They said, but we don't want them to come because we're telling them they can't. And this interesting struggle began a little more politically. The union did a calculation, and again, I'm distinguishing between teachers and union leadership. And the union leadership did a calculation, and I think it was basically this. All their middle rank of teaching specialists said, we're going to come and join the conversation and start building this new world. And the union bosses said, you can't, and they said, we are anyway. The union bosses the next day said, you have our approval. So the union did a political check. They checked their social license and realized it wasn't as strong as they thought. And I think part of that was because the future that we were projecting of a transformed system, true teacher autonomy, teachers really being in the, no teacher that I know got in the business of teaching to cover curriculum. I like to cover curriculum. They like to teach kids. They like to facilitate learning. That's why they got into business. And so the union's version of the future wasn't as compelling as our version of the future. And so the union had to do a lot of backroom work to make it okay. They then came out with a paper that summer saying this was all their idea, and they came up with it first. We said, perfect. You can have it. Well, fast forward to right now. Last Wednesday of last week, our teachers all went on strike. They're still teaching, but they're on this job action where they're not meeting for bargaining contracts. This time, for the first time ever, they've come to us on the learning side of things. So the government's, the bargaining agent over here, they've come to the learning side and said, but we're going to keep meeting. We've given all our teachers permission because this is too important to miss. This is the best opportunity we've had to transform this system the way teachers would like to see it, which is the same way government would like to see it. So they don't want to mess that up. So it's a very different landscape. So initially it was banging heads. Then they had to agree it was sort of a compelling idea, their membership, because we just kept telling the stories. It could be like this, folks. It could be like this. It could be like this. We do this together. And then the union had to change their political view of how this is going to work. So like I say, today, where we're engaged in stage 1 of job action, it's very different because they're still coming and meeting on all the committees, on all the writing curriculum, they're fully engaged, and that's never happened.
Sibeli, parte da minha pergunta, o professor já começou a responder, então eu queria complementar um pouco mais. Tenho uma crença inabalável no processo colaborativo, junto com os educadores e gestores, para a construção de um projeto de transformação de educação. E nesse diálogo do processo de transformação, o senhor trouxe uma questão importantíssima, ao meu ver, do que eu entendi, a minha pergunta vai nessa direção, que é com relação aos programas estruturados em que os professores não são co-autores ou autores, ou então sujeitos, participantes, pensantes desse processo de construção de um programa. E se dentro desse processo todo, pelo que eu entendi, parece mais volta a pergunta, do processo que os professores fazem a construir esses programas junto com as redes e sistemas educacionais.
I have a very complicated diagram I could show you. No slide rules. Because it's an iterative process. And so we have, so for example with curriculum, and I know we're talking a lot about curriculum, but that's only one piece of all the pieces that need, lots of things that need to change. We did it with the union, with teachers, in classrooms, and very publicly. And everyone sort of understood how that worked, and I talked about that already. We're having a similar but slightly differently organized conversation around assessment, because that's a bit trickier and is more politically laden sometimes. So we're doing that with the post-secondary institutions, with our teachers union, with our principals and vice principals and our district superintendents, and our parents and our students. So all those people are engaged together in a conversation about how we think about assessment frameworks provincially. We happen to be a province. Our teachers are very good in British Columbia at classroom assessment. They're I think, quite a strength, and they're very good at it. But our provincial assessment program, which is very political. And so that's another process that's cooking away at the same time as the curriculum work is going on. And they're very related, and they're going to have to join up at the end, but we haven't joined them yet. And so far we've gotten away with that. A third big piece of that is the competencies. How do you assess competencies? How do you know how well your students are doing at collaboration, or creativity, or their personal and social development? That's a struggle. And so we've started this conversation without knowing clearly yet what those are going to be like, because those are being written and developed, I should say, by a third process that's being done through our school districts. Still with teachers, but it's being managed farther outside of government by our school districts. And it's iterative. So as people saw the drafts of our curriculum, they went, oh, I'm changing my ideas around assessment. And that entered into the assessment conversation. And as the competencies are getting clearer and clearer, people are going, oh, I see that, how that affects our curriculum and our assessment. So those are getting revised again. And so we're in this cycle of an iterative cycle of slightly changing things as we know more and learn more. Because part of the problem is there's very few examples of systems out there who've done this. So it's hard to look at some place and go, let's see what you've done. And so we're sort of building this while the airplane's building the airplane while it's flying. And so we know it's iterative. We have three connected and similar principles to our processes, but right now three completely different processes, how we're developing three key areas. We also know our graduation program is the fourth that's just coming online, because that really matters, how kids get into university or into the world of work, how we assess if a student knows what they need to know to graduate, has the competencies. And so that's a fourth piece that's moving simultaneously right now. And our job is to try to keep those things all woven together as they develop. So a metaphor I like to use, it's more like a ship coming out of the mist. As it gets closer, it gets clearer. And the whole thing is getting clearer and clearer and clearer as we're working on all the pieces, but it is iterative. I don't know if I answered your question at all.
César, se você quiser depois mais esclarecimento, Sibeli, você fala. César, você.
Minha pergunta é sobre avaliação formativa, formative assessment. Existem vários estudos que mostram que o que mais dá impacto em ganhos de aprendizagem, né? Dylan Williams, outros especialistas, John Hattie, que mostram que a avaliação formativa é o que mais contribui. E o que nós vimos nas apresentações são sempre o uso de tecnologia, principalmente para a parte de avaliações objetivas. A minha pergunta é o que existe, o que vocês têm visto usado para o processo de avaliação formativa entendida como apresenta, por exemplo, Dylan Williams, né? Problemas abertos que fornecem uma janela para o pensamento e para as competências do aluno, e aí, então, um processo de feedback do professor, processo de autoavaliação, avaliação de pares. Então, nesse contexto, o que vocês conhecem ou acreditam no uso de tecnologia?
I'll start. It's a great question. And I think it's always a matter of balance. So in many cases of the types of assessment you're describing, I don't know that there is a technological answer to it. I think often that is face-to-face, teacher and students, students and students, coming to those decisions about the formative assessment. I think data helps. Michael talked about there's good data and bad data, or there's good ways to use it and bad ways to use it, and I think sometimes in formative assessment, some of the less productive ways creep in, and we can misuse data sometimes. But I think nothing replaces the relationship and the knowledge of a teacher, that professional knowledge and judgment of a teacher and students working collaboratively around formative assessment. So, I'll leave it there. Let Michael clean up my answer.
Let me give you an overarching thought and then 3 examples. The overarching thought is I actually think that in a competency-based learning world, where time becomes the variable and learning is constant, that the distinction between summative and formative assessments is an old construct. And instead we ought to be thinking about it as sort of iterative assessment or something where every assessment is both for learning as well as high stakes. Meaning every time you take an assessment, it helps you understand what you should do next. But if you don't master it, then you keep working. Whereas if you do, you move on to something else. So everything, and so it sort of sheds away these distinctions where psychometricians, test makers say, oh, you can't use that for learning because it's not valid for that. It does away with these, what I think are categories built out of the factory model system. So I think as we move in that direction where every assessment is both high stakes and for learning, in terms of your question around the performance-based assessments and how does technology play into that, I think we're seeing 3 things occur. One is there are programs like Show Evidence that are starting to pop up that allow teachers online to very quickly give feedback and actually see, so like in a paper, you actually have to show evidence, right? That you've, in some argument that you're making or whatever it is, and it can be a paper, it can be a video, it can be a variety of things. And it basically helps teachers to quickly look through and assess, did this person actually understand the competencies that I wanted them to achieve? Summit Public Schools that we talked earlier loves this tool to do a lot of the performance-based assessments for their projects that they do. The second one is some people are taking another tact, which is relying on computers to get smarter and smarter at actually being able to evaluate written product or certain things themselves. And so the Hewlett Foundation, for example, sponsored a competition to try to spur the creation of better machine-based assessments to actually evaluate real writing. And they got some actually pretty remarkable results, not from the big companies, but from individuals around the world who actually said, I know how to do that better. and that we're able to get results that were on par with human graders in some cases. It's not going to be for everything, but I think some things will be able to be automated. And then the third thing, Western Governors University, which is a university based in the United States that's competency-based. They offer degrees in teaching, nursing, and I think IT. And what they do is they've changed the role of faculty and teachers completely in the system. So let me just describe this to you, and then it'll make sense. What they have is PhD level faculty who help to create the courses and curate content from all over the world so that a student can learn however makes sense for them, right? The standards. And then they have master's level professors, not PhD, but masters. And these are the people who really are your learning coach on the ground and spending the time with you to help you, tutor you, and make sure that you learn and can answer questions. Because it turns out that the PhD professors don't actually like spending that much time with students. And then the third type of teacher that they have is what they call the assessors or the evaluators. And these people are totally separate from your learning coach. And they exist only to evaluate performance-based assessments. And the reason that they separated this is twofold. One, it gets rid of the bias questions so that a student can't complain, oh, I didn't pass because my teacher didn't like me. It gets rid of that completely. And secondly, what they realized is a lot of teachers are not trained in being great assessors. Like, it's a really hard skill. One of the things that Rod does is, and he sort of glossed over it, but it's a really important point. Every competency they look at and they say, how would we know if someone had actually mastered that? And that creates a huge conversation over what's the assessment, what sort of work do we need to see to know that it's true? And so they basically have a whole group of professionals whose whole job is to evaluate really deep performance-based work to see, do you really know this? And so technology there is just a way to communicate the assessment over to this person who's virtual from you, just because that's how their model works. So those are three different pathways that we see. I don't think one is necessarily right. I just think different ones are going to work in different circumstances.
Camila.
Bom, Camila, da Fundação Lehman. Minha pergunta é para o Michael, mas acredito que o Rod também pode comentar isso. Eu achei muito interessante que nos seus slides você colocou os padrões do Common Core na sua coluna da direita, como uma política que contribui para um modelo com mais autonomia para professores e diretores. E eu queria que você desenvolvesse um pouco essa ideia, porque no Brasil, o debate sobre um padrão curricular ou uma base nacional comum muitas vezes ficou travado ou fica travado por parecer algo que pode tirar a autonomia dos professores e dos diretores. Então, queria que você falasse um pouco mais, e o Rod também, sobre a ideia de um padrão curricular que pode abrir espaço para inovação e para maior autonomia.
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm glad you called me on it because it was a point I meant to make and I forgot in my talk. On the left-hand side of my slide, I had standardization as the thing to get away from, and I had standards as something that was desirable. And so what we see actually, people think standards and standardization are the same. They're not. Standards are just telling you what the outcome has to be, what you want to achieve. It doesn't say how you achieve it. It says people figure out different ways of doing it, but standards in industry after industry, it's the thing that enables customization because it helps you understand how pieces have to fit together and work together. That's it. It shouldn't prescribe how you teach something or how someone learns something. That's standardization, and that's to be fought at all costs. The critical thing I think about standards in the United States is that it is not a national curriculum. It is not a national curriculum. It says you can realize these standards by reading lots of different texts or doing or learning math in different ways. You just have to show that you're proficient in these. And so that's a really important point. I think a national curriculum that prescribes the individual texts and actual activities at a very granular level, that's not what I'm recommending. I really mean a high level, this is what you should know and be able to do. And then the second part of it that I hope we keep to in the US, I think it will be challenging, but I hope that we keep to the fewer, clearer, higher part of that. So I don't think we want to have, how many standards did you say you used to have before?
But no.
like
10,000.
10,000, right? And so
K to 12.
yeah, I mean, so then it basically becomes a de facto curriculum, and and people are an inch deep and a mile wide, and they have no depth. What I think we want is fewer standards so that you can go deeper in them, and depth can be really exciting. Competencies go beyond standards. Secondly, so that at some point you're done with them, and then you can start to explore the other millions of topics of interest out there that go beyond the standards. But all it says is basically a citizen needs to be able to know and do certain things. Basic math, basic literacy, a basic sense of civics and history, and probably science too, are critical to being citizens in this world. And if we lose that, we lose something from the fabric of being able to be successful, not just in your career, but quite frankly as a life citizen in society.
I completely agree, and what I couldn't show you is what our curriculum used to look like. You can go online and see it because it's still there. It's atrocious. In grade 2, so the kids that are grade 2, they're about 7 years old. Grade 2 language arts, we had 92 learning outcomes. Grade 2 language arts. And there should be about, 10. Learn to read, play nice, don't eat paste, pick up your toys. And yet some really important, so our teachers told us clearly, some really important things got lost in the mix because teachers were playing lifeboat. They kept throwing things overboard because there wasn't time. And so they were making those choices, and they're saying, well, now help us with those. If there's some things, tell us what's really important. We'll make sure we do that, but don't hide it in a list of 90. So now you see us with maybe 10 things and 4 or 5 big ideas. And so when a teacher's thinking about what they teach, they're focused on those big ideas, which are what kids need to come to understand, not be taught. It's no good to teach those and say, I'm done. Your children have to understand them. And that leads to different types of assessment, leads us into deeper kinds of assessment, and different kinds of activities. And so it becomes, as Michael said, we want fewer but clearer standards or outcomes, and a lot of flexibility on how you get there. And that's where the professionalism of teachers comes in, is how do you, here's the kids I have, how do I help them get there? That's my job. And it's not about coverage anymore. We've also changed from this idea in our language that curriculum is something that the teachers had to cover. Curriculum should be uncovered, not covered. Coverage gives you that race to, I've only got 5 days left and 10 things to teach, and I just have to go faster. We've also changed the focus of our conversation in British Columbia. We rarely talk about teaching anymore. We almost only talk about learning. We talk about the outputs rather than the inputs. Because the inputs are so varied, because teachers as professionals, they come at this all kinds of different ways, and that's all good. We really care about, and collectively care about, those outputs. What's the learning that's happened?
Yeah, I'll tell one story. I talked about the Vietnamese system this morning, but the really interesting thing about that was the conversation you would have with teachers and with the Ministry of Education in Vietnam, because the ministry would just scream, why aren't these teachers being more innovative? And then the teachers would scream when you talk to them and say, they want to know why I can't be more innovative because I'm supposed to teach this exact same lesson in the national curriculum on this exact same day for every single one of my students, regardless if they're ready for it. And so, yeah, the ministry's right to want more innovative teaching and learning, but holy cow, you got to free it up so that they can do it. Because, yeah, I'm sure there's going to need to be training and convincing and motivating, but you can't do it with a national curriculum like that. So that's not what I think we're talking about. And in Vietnam and Korea, they both said, oh, United States is moving more toward a national curriculum. That's not right. What we're moving toward is towards standards that should be common across states. And the word national, if any of you follow U.S. politics, is a very dangerous word in the United States. So we're talking about common standards and not explicitly not curriculum.
Parece que dos grandes desafios aí é esse equilíbrio entre você ter alguns parâmetros que possam, de alguma forma, definir onde se quer chegar, mas muita autonomia para se inovar e se personalizar, se adaptar o processo a cada aluno, a cada ritmo, a cada contexto. Esse é sempre o grande desafio, principalmente quando a gente fala de grandes redes, em que você fica sempre naquela dúvida se é melhor padronizar para garantir um mínimo de qualidade ou você dá a liberdade e como é que você acompanha, monitora isso, alguns desafios. Mas eu vou deixar o Haroldo falar.
Haroldo Torres, da Fundação SEAD. Eu queria trazer um pouco a discussão para o Brasil, porque eu acho que a gente vive uma situação de contexto que é muito diferente. Então, só para dar alguns números, nós estamos falando de apenas 50% dos nossos jovens de 15 a 17 anos cursando o ensino médio. Nós estamos falando de 1/3 dos jovens que estão no ensino médio no ensino noturno. Então, o ensino médio noturno. Nós estamos falando também de um número muito elevado de jovens que chegam ao ensino médio sabendo muito pouco. Então, eu queria um pouco provocá-los a nos ajudar a pensar como é que a gente pode pensar essas metodologias, tecnologias e propostas para uma situação em um sistema que tem deficiências tão importantes.
Só para complementar, um pouco o que Teca trazia no início, né? Como a gente ainda tem tantos problemas básicos a resolver, como infraestrutura, como qualificação básica de professor, como acesso em muitos lugares, e, ao mesmo tempo, a gente tem o desafio de inovar. Quer dizer, é possível que a inovação seja uma forma da gente acelerar a solução dos problemas básicos? Ou, acho que a Maria Helena, você quer complementar essa mesma pergunta? Só para a gente não perder a do Haroldo lá para...
Então, complementando a do Haroldo, a pergunta é se vocês conhecem alguma experiência onde o uso de tecnologias contribuiu para melhorar o aprendizado, sobretudo das populações das periferias, das grandes cidades, das áreas metropolitanas, das populações mais vulneráveis, especialmente os jovens.
Sure. Let me just make sure I clarify the last part of the question. I'll answer both. But when you say the periphery of the population, in Brazil specifically, or anywhere in the world, like India, anywhere. Okay, great. So, I think what you said is right, which is the question is not that we're trying to force something else upon Brazil in terms of what students need to know and be able to do. You're quite right, I'm sure, you know better than I, where the students' achievement levels are. My argument is that through these new methodologies, through this innovation, that you can more efficiently and quickly help students grab onto this basic knowledge and skills that they need to be successful in these areas. Let me give one example from Korea and one example from India, okay, outside. So just in Korea, in terms of the after school, the same thing happens in Korea. Students sleep from 7 to 4 p.m. in schools. Literally, the teacher's lecturing, and the students have pillows and blankets and are sleeping. It's not to be believed. And then they stay after school for about 4 hours where they study individually, and then they go to after-school academy until about 1 in the morning, even though it's illegal past 10 p.m., where they actually get tutoring and actually learn the material. It's called Hagwon, cram school, okay? This is where they do their learning. And so the government's reaction has been, let's make the after school illegal. Let's block all the opportunities for people to do this. So in 1980, when there was a military dictatorship, they actually made after school learning illegal. You weren't allowed to do it anymore. And so what happened was students started riding around in cars with tutors that they paid them. And if they got pulled over by the police officer, they said, "Are you learning right now?" They'd say, No, we're just going to the store together. And they would literally get tutored while they would drive around in cars. And then that didn't work, so then they put the curfew of 10 p.m. is currently a law, and people get around that. They stay until 1, 2 a.m., and that's why they're so tired that they sleep during school. And then thirdly, they just, in February, passed a new law banning advanced learning. You say, what's advanced learning? It means you're not allowed to learn a subject ahead of your age. It's the opposite of personalized learning, folks. You're not allowed, and so why do they do this? Okay, I get it. They want to reduce the competition. They think kids are really stressed and unhappy. They are. They're unhappy because their schools are terrible, because they're lecturing at them and they're not learning. So they feel the need to go to these after-school programs and spend tons of money. Their birth rate is now only 1.2 per woman, and it's the second highest suicide rate in the world. Got to make the schools warm, nurturing places where they can learn more efficiently. And when they flipped the classroom, a tactic that I talked about earlier in Busan, in the southeast portion of Korea, they got astounding results on the test. Students were far happier, and they said, we don't need to go to Hagwon anymore. It's only 2 schools, so it's early. But the point is that these methodologies, this is why I go crazy when people blame the tests in and of themselves. We're not preparing students to be successful, which is why it's showing up. Tests are just a dumb indicator of one way or the other. They're not great, but they're good enough to show we're not doing a good enough job. And so that's sort of the takeaway. In terms of the question, can they help people on the fringes? In India, there's a great TED Talk called the Hole in the Wall Experiment. They just put a computer in a slum. Right, and students started learning. So I'm not recommending that for Brazil. I think schools are probably important community centers. Okay, maybe you're shrugging your shoulders, maybe it's a good idea, but that's not my recommendation here today. All I'm saying is that it's an important enabler. It is not a guarantee of good learning occurring. You got to lead with the learning question. But can technology be used by poor kids? Absolutely, right? Absolutely at the fringes. We see it in India. We see people in Mongolia using, literally they barely have electricity in some of these schools. They're taking MOOCs from MIT and teaching unbelievably advanced concepts to their other students in the class. Can they use them? Absolutely. The question on us as educators is, how do we make this equitable so that everyone has that opportunity, not just the lucky person who happened to be in the class where the teacher was farsighted enough to do it?
So from British Columbia's experience, we have, we're not Brazil size, but we have a very dispersed, we have a core around Vancouver, and there's everywhere else. Often lots of very small communities with schools of very small size, where parents have no choice about which school they send their children to. There might only be one school in that community. We have, and outside of Vancouver, we have a large Aboriginal population everywhere, but certainly a large Aboriginal population percentage-wise increases as you move out. I was superintendent of schools in a northern rural district, and we were about 25% Aboriginal students. And the technology, our connectivity has really helped those areas. We'll get to what you do with it in a second, but so one of the things that was a focus was getting all those small rural communities hooked up to high-speed access. And that was a greater focus to get, often fiber optic cable in there, because those communities really used it in some really profound ways. They used it for healthcare. They used it for education. They used it just for communication. And what we found over time is that it's allowed some of those small, especially small secondary schools, to do things very differently. Our most innovative schools are small, rural, secondary schools, because they've had to innovate or they die. So they're doing things very differently. They're using content that's coming in differently. So they have very interesting takes on the blended classroom or the blended experience. I wouldn't even say classrooms, but blended learning models, because they have to. They may not have the expert physics teacher and chemistry teacher, whatever, in those areas, and so how is it that they think about that? They're hiring different sorts of teachers now. They're hiring more generalist teachers often than just a straight physics teacher, or they're hiring science generalists perhaps, who who can help connect all those pieces of learning for kids into more meaningful ways. And the raw content can come from elsewhere, come from online, and yet you still need face-to-face and teachers to help kids make sense of that. Content is available online, not necessarily learning or understanding. So you often still need humans for that. We're also finding that more and more young teachers are choosing to live in more rural communities for the quality of life, because they can now also become the specialist chemistry teacher, if that's still their focus, let's say, because they can interact with teachers from students all around the province electronically through various blended models. So on the one hand, there's sort of two stories going on. On the one hand, we're seeing younger people choosing quality of life. They like living in more rural communities. We have some gorgeous places to live, just like Brazil does. And it's less of a hardship because those places are more connected now. But also the use of technology, really connecting those places and allowing content, access to other kids from around the world, access to other interest groups from around the world and around the province as well. I'm just going to say for our Aboriginal learners, that's become really, really, really important because their families really want them to stay in their local communities. They don't want them to leave. And so needing to provide access in local communities is very important to them, so they can keep their cultural roots. And so, again, they're using technology and blended learning experiences in, yet again, some slightly different ways.
We're seeing the same thing in the rural areas of the United States, like he described, for the same reason, that necessity. I think people in the United States are surprised that the biggest and fastest changes in the United States in this area occurred in the southeast parts of the country, because those were the most rural areas initially. And I think the other part I would just add is, even though content is certainly free online, but teachers can be accessible online too in these new environments where, say, you have one chemistry teacher, hypothetically, in one rural area. That teacher now can teach people in the school, but also people in several schools in many, many different areas, which is a tremendous opportunity to scale the impact of that person beyond the geography. And then all of these students in different areas can work together. One thing we're seeing is that as a result of that, if a school wants, a forensics a class or something like that, they can partner and create all sorts of cooperatives to lend expertise across big geographies and have students collaborate with each other from lots of different regions together to solve problems online as well. So there's lots of varieties of this, and it's important not to get, just because of the example one of us may or may not have used, to say that's the way, that's what they're talking about. We're seeing a diversity of ways to do this.
And I'll just add one more thing about learning, and that's teacher learning. And so often the most isolated people in those communities are the teachers. And so, how do they collaborate with other teachers and teach similar things with them if they're the only game in town? So we have a strong series of networks, collaborative networks for our teachers, professional learning networks for our teachers. And those can only exist because of technology. Those teachers can get together all the time, talk about their classroom practice with other people with similar experiences. So we find our rural teachers are often more connected to their peers than our urban teachers.
Então, na verdade, acho que tem uma questão aí, mais uma vez, voltando ao que já foi falado algumas vezes. A solução não começa pela tecnologia, mas se a gente não aproveitar o que ela oferece também, nós vamos estar desperdiçando grandes oportunidades. Então, só voltando à pergunta do Haroldo, quando a gente fala de uma população jovem que está estudando à noite, você pode imaginar o que isso representa em termos de como motivar esse aluno e como, na verdade, você está lidando com uma variedade de conhecimentos ou ritmos, dificuldades ali daqueles alunos. Quer dizer, você colocar a tecnologia no que hoje a gente chama de educação de jovens e adultos, no ensino noturno e mesmo no ensino médio diurno, tem uma série de coisas aí que hoje a gente sabe que são impedimentos, né, para acesso e conclusão de ensino médio, que a gente de fato pode alcançar. Mas uma coisa que é interessante observar é essa questão da tecnologia ajudando a formação dos próprios professores. Como que a gente é coerente quando a gente fala como é que a gente vai formar professor para usar educação por projeto, personalização, tecnologia, se eles não usam isso, nem usaram isso quando eram alunos, nem usam na sua formação. Eles vão praticamente reproduzir os modelos que eles estão acostumados não só a ouvir falar, mas a vivenciar. Então, quando a gente pensa em formação, tanto inicial quanto continuada de professores, me parece que usar todas essas metodologias inovadoras é a melhor forma de fato, prepará-los e motivá-los a depois utilizar essas mesmas alternativas, possibilidades com os seus alunos. E a questão da educação nas áreas rurais, tem um projeto grande agora da Fundação Telefônica, né, para conectar muitas escolas da zona rural aqui no Brasil, vale a pena a gente acompanhar. Mas eu acho que eu vou remeter a uma outra questão que foi surgindo desde manhã, que são hoje professores com múltiplos papéis, de curador de conteúdo, de facilitador, de tutor, de mentor, de avaliador, de coordenador de projetos, e não necessariamente, para a gente não ficar esperando pelo super-homem, essas competências têm que estar num professor só. Então, alguém falou de manhã dessa questão de você quebrar um pouco as paredes e permitir que alunos, inclusive de diferentes séries e idades, possam estar aprendendo no mesmo ambiente com professores com competências diferentes, conduzindo processos diferentes. E nas escolas da zona rural, muitas vezes você não consegue, hoje tem um apagão de professores no Brasil, você não consegue professor de física, química, biologia para ensinar em escolas, às vezes, mais remotas. Mas você pode ter esses professores remotos, como o projeto Minerva, que é uma universidade em que todos os professores são remotos, mas você ter mentores, mediadores, facilitadores de projetos junto com os alunos. Quer dizer, é possível também fazer esse ensino híbrido, aí, esse blended, como eles falam, nessa perspectiva, né? Não só de você ter numa mesma sala de aula como o mesmo professor, mas você ter diferentes estímulos de professores com competências distintas, alguns presenciais e outros online, né? Tem perguntas aqui? Várias, hein? Então, sabe o que a gente vai fazer agora? Porque a gente só tem mais 12 minutos. Vamos fazer uma rodada de 3 desse lado aqui e depois uma rodada de 3 desse lado aqui. Acho que dá para cobrir todo mundo, tá? Só levantar aqui e ali. Aquelas 6 observou, né? Tá bom.
Mário Ritter, conselheiro da Tombola. A gente está falando de tecnologia, mas sem um setor de tecnologia aplicada à educação, fica difícil de implementar todas essas dinâmicas que nós estamos falando. Então, como é que você vê nos países de vocês a criação desse setor, e como é que gerencia mercado para esse tipo de iniciativas, sem os quais eles também não...
Ali.
Eu sou Maria...
Pode falar, Tete, que tá.
Eu sou Maria Tereza Marcílio, da Avante, Educação e Mobilização Social, uma organização em Salvador, Bahia. A minha questão é mais para o Rod, e é mais a partir do diálogo que vocês construíram com os professores, no sentido de elaborar um currículo e um programa. Eu acho que, aqui, trazendo um paralelo para o Brasil, existe uma natural desconfiança governo-professor. Eu acho que isso não é só do Brasil. O governo nunca é um elemento de muita confiança da população. E com os professores, principalmente. Eu digo isso, inclusive, porque já tive no governo. Mas isso é uma coisa que é uma realidade. E achei admirável a forma como vocês conseguiram atrair, conquistar os professores para a co-construção do currículo, me parece que basicamente pelo uso da confiança e do respeito a essa categoria, né, que são os professores. A minha pergunta, eu acho que isso a gente ainda tem muito que aprender aqui no Brasil, porque os professores não são normalmente respeitados nem considerados. E a outra questão que eu ia fazer em relação a, puxando isso para as famílias, se você tem alguma experiência de inclusão de famílias nesse diálogo, que também aqui no Brasil, me parece que um dos graves problemas é a distância entre a escola e a família. E mais grave ainda, porque aqui no Brasil a escola pública é, de fato, para uma população pobre que já não é muito vista, nem ouvida, nem considerada. E como é que e aí, tanto pelo governo quanto pelos professores. O professor não gosta que a família chegue perto. Então, como é que a gente cria mecanismos, ou o que é possível fazer para trazer a família para dentro da escola com o mesmo respeito, a mesma confiança e a mesma crença de que sem ela nós não vamos fazer uma boa educação.
Judite. Sou Judite, trabalho no Centro Estadual de Educação Tecnológica, Paula Souza. Minha pergunta é se já tem algum resultado, perspectiva ou meta de como essas políticas dialogam com a inserção profissional desses alunos que passam por esses projetos inovadores, em termos de desenvolvimento local, desenvolvimento econômico, social, pós, quando eles saem dessas escolas, desses projetos.
Vamos para respostas já mais rápidas agora, e aí a gente vai para a última sessão.
I'll quickly do the first one. So the question was technology people. Did you mean supporting like chief technology officers within districts, or did you mean entrepreneurs? Entrepreneurs, okay. So we're seeing in the United States, to answer your question, a huge number of people very interested in starting companies around taking technology to education. What I think has changed in the last 4 years is two things. One, people are realizing that there's that education is one of the last places that's been untouched by technology. And so there's a lot of investment dollars as a result starting to come into education to see if it can be helpful. And then the second thing is engineers for a long time sort of said, I'd love to do something about education, but it's just not an interesting engineering problem. I'll try to optimize the world's mobile advertisement instead. And I think that's changing in the last few years as people are starting to say, gee, education has some very interesting engineering problems. And therefore, we're starting to get top talent who are actually going to education companies, even though the profits, are not going to be as interesting as, say, that mobile advertising company. So that's a big switch, but I think a very encouraging thing that I don't think will just be in the U.S. I think it'll start to be worldwide over time, because some of the more interesting solutions, I think, to local problems will be from local entrepreneurs, quite frankly.
With respect to parents, yes and no. We spend a lot of time, I spend a lot of time working with parents and parent groups around the province. But I know that every time I speak to a group of parents, the next day they go to their child's teacher or their child's principal and say, I saw this guy from the ministry with this black suit on and he's telling me this. Is that true? Do you believe that? Is that good for kids? Is that good for my child? Because there's a trust relationship built up with the people that you know, as opposed to somebody like me. So we're really trying to equip schools and teachers with the tools to have those conversations with parents, but more importantly with the expectation that they need to have those conversations with parents. And so when I model those conversations, especially with our First Nations, Aboriginal parents, they don't want to come to school to hear all the list of things that are wrong with their kids. We've done that for years. The only interaction most parents have with their child's teacher is come in and hear all the things that are the problems with your child. But when that conversation, and especially with our Aboriginal First Nations population, is I'm going to spend more waking hours with your child in the next year than you are as your child's teacher. And I think it's important that I know as much as I can about your child to help make good decisions and to help include you in those decisions and your child. So you're the expert on your child. Let's talk. No parent doesn't want to have that conversation. They don't want to come in for a negative one, but they're happy for positive ones. We encourage our teachers to go out to schools or go out to homes of parents who don't want to come in. Lots of different ways to try to have those conversations, but really they're more locally based. And the last thing I'll say on it is a Henry Ford quote. Henry Ford famously said, "If I asked people what they wanted, they would have said a faster horse." And so we find when we talk to parents and we say, "Are you happy with the kind of report cards or communication you have with your child's teacher?" They say no. They say, and if you just say then, "Well, what would you like better?" They say, "Well, we want more of the only things we know. We want more letter grades. We want more parent-teacher interviews that are agonizingly boring," and because they only know what they know. So you have to always provide them with another series of opportunities or options, saying, "These kinds of things are possible. Are you interested in any of those?" "Oh, I didn't know those were options." "Yeah." And all of a sudden you get into a conversation of what's possible, and it becomes a positive future thinking conversation rather than a negative, "I don't like the teacher," and "I don't like the parent," and into those often negative conversations. As to sort of our expectations or the kinds of things that we're expecting to evaluate, I mean, we haven't graduated any kids yet under this model. All we have are anecdotal evaluations of employers and parents and the post-secondary institutions that are starting to get groups of these kids that have come through with pieces of this, and they are unanimously positive. Your kids ask great questions. We know that some schools tend to get more of their kids placed into the right kind of university programs because of the quality of the interaction, not their paper letter grades. So we're really starting to see that happen, and also from the world of work, because they're not used to being asked what they think about our product.
I'll be super quick on the last one, because as you said, it's still early. I would look at some of the higher education ones that are moving to this and seeing the placements to get some of the results. I think General Assembly and Dev Bootcamp are two very interesting blended learning innovations to help place people into engineering and computer science jobs that seem to be very successful right now with blending. I think University Now, Learn Up, Southern New Hampshire's College for America, and Western Governors University are a few others that I would look at as well.
And I would just also further add, some of the best evaluators we have of the success of this are the kids themselves. And so ask the kids. And we know if they're staying in school, they're staying engaged, they're turned on to learning, that's the indicator.
Nós vamos agora rapidamente para a última rodada de perguntas. Temos aqui, ali e ali no fundo, tá? Vamos lá.
Boa tarde, Patrícia Zapolsky, do Instituto de Pesquisa Econômica Aplicada. Minha pergunta tem um rumo um pouco diferente. Nós falamos sobre educação e tecnologia com foco na educação de crianças, jovens e um pouco de professores. Agora, num cenário de envelhecimento da população, eu gostaria que vocês comentassem o possível papel da tecnologia e das inovações na educação para o aprendizado, para o lifelong learning de adultos e na manutenção dessa capacidade cognitiva, criativa e produtiva. Quais seriam possíveis implicações de políticas públicas?
Obrigada.
Obrigado, meu nome é Diogo Bueno, eu sou da Coordenadoria de Relações Internacionais da Prefeitura de Guarulhos, da qual coordenamos hoje a unidade temática de educação da rede Mercocidades. Minha pergunta é bem simples. Vocês falaram da formação de professores, essa relação toda, me vem a questão, um assunto que foi tratado até um pouco no evento do ano passado, que é a questão do letramento digital. Ou seja, tem muitos professores que são grandes literários, mas não têm o domínio e vice-versa. Então, na verdade, era um pouco isso, entender qual é o papel que vocês enxergam no letramento digital.
Eu sou Vitor Rizovas, sou professor da Escola Comunitária de Campinas e pesquisador da Universidade Estadual de Campinas. Rod, durante a sua apresentação você mencionou os parâmetros da OCDE, né? E habilidades e competências, e de que, né, de uma certa forma, isso é uma referência para o mundo ocidental todo. Aqui no Brasil, a gente tem criticado um pouco uma certa visão de que esses parâmetros formam um pouco cidadãos politicamente dóceis e economicamente ativos. E eu achei muito interessante que no seu slide você tinha ali um guia para um bom cidadão. Então, se o padrão não é o emprego, se o objetivo da educação maior, o objetivo maior da educação não é o emprego, mas sim um bom cidadão, de que forma você dialoga com essa referência da OCDE e de que forma vocês estabeleceram um padrão do bom cidadão, né? De onde vem esse conceito de cidadania, essa noção de cidadania?
Então vamos lá para a última rodada e aí o que vocês quiserem.
In 1 minute or less.
Sure. So I'm definitely going to leave the last question to Rod because I have no idea. So for the first two on the lifelong learning, what are the possible implications for policy? Great question, because I think you're exactly right. What comes out of this is that we've historically thought of as college as this 4-year thing that you go to, and then that's it. And the reality is now you're going to two things. One, jobs are changing quite a bit. So you talk to like a massive telecommunications company that has maybe thousands and thousands of mid-level engineers. The job requirements for those people change roughly every 3 years today. And so they have to constantly be learning new skills. And so what I think you're seeing is entities like Udacity or others coming in that provide small chunks of learning that keep leveling you up throughout life. And then as you get older and older, the policy implications I think are pretty interesting. So an example from America, well actually, so both India and America. Do people know Tata, the Indian company? It's one of the largest companies in the entire world. One of their businesses is Tata Consulting Services, where they train up engineers and computer scientists to solve problems. They had a good training program in India that could, within 6 months, produce people that could be then employees at their company. And what's happened in the U.S. is similar to what happened when Toyota was disrupting America's auto companies, is we put up tariffs to try to keep products from outside. And so what the people do to get around them is they build plants inside of the United States themselves. And so Tata did that recently in Detroit. And for those that know, Detroit, Michigan has been totally decimated in the last several years. It is sort of a bit of a war zone with people just out of work and lots of crime and bad learning. And they took out-of-work machinists who were age 50 and older, I think. So people said they're hopeless, you can't retrain them for anything at this point, the best we can do is government welfare. Tata retrained these people in 6 months and employed 1,000 of them for them, or something like 50%. I mean, that's astounding to think about what that does now for work in the future and so forth. Last thought on that, which is teachers. Teaching, people often have retired at 55 or 60 or 65, depending on your system, and then sort of express this desire that maybe I don't want to be in a school full-time, but I'd like to teach a class or two. With these technologies now, they can continue to be part of that environment and continue to use their expertise to reach people. So I think that's exciting. The second question, digital literacy for teachers. It's a huge point. I'd say two things. One, a caution. I think there are some people that say because the current young teachers are technology literate when they come into the teaching workforce, therefore they will naturally make these shifts into more student-centered environments. I don't think that's true. And the reason is because of what you said earlier, which is that even though they may know how to use the technology, they actually have to know how to use the pedagogy and the methodologies in new ways. And if they've just been taught stand and deliver, that's all they sort of know. So I think, yes, you have to help people who are less familiar with the technology certainly become familiar enough to be able to be competent in these environments, but we can't neglect the pedagogy alongside it. One of the big myths, I think, is that this problem will solve itself as young teachers come into the workforce, and that's simply not the case as far as I can see from the data.
I've been given 30 seconds.
Yes.
And if I was younger, I'd remember both questions, and if I was even younger, I would remember to bring a pencil to write it down. I'm not sure that digital literacy as a concept exists. I think they're just literacies. And the sense that it's something separate from, we don't have pencil literacy or ballpoint pen literacy. They're just literacies, and we would expect all our teachers to be competent and literate. That doesn't mean we all have exactly the same skill set. So the quick answer is you put the technology in the hands of the kids and let's just see what happens. We were at a school in India where every week the students had time with the teaching staff to bring them up to speed on various technological changes that were going on. When smart boards were introduced into the school, they were put in the hands of students, not teachers. And the students trained the teachers then started using the tool, and everything was wonderful. The OECD question is a great one. I happen to think that teaching is a subversive act, and contrary to the black student in government thing, as a teacher, I believe that teaching is a subversive act. We want change in our system. We want change in our society. We want kids to be better caretakers of the world. I think OECD is thinking that too, and I think those competencies and the kinds of things that I want kids to be good, in order to be good citizens, I think are pretty commonplace to place. But again, I think culture eats policy for breakfast, and so it's how those are interpreted locally and in various jurisdictions. So I take comfort that the OECD is agonizing over assessment. I take great comfort in that. I take great comfort in the fact they think they don't have it right. I take great comfort in the fact they're looking at digital online collaborative problem solving. That's kind of cool, and I think that can be quite disruptive. So I think that's all good. The last part I'll say is, as a dad, I hope my kid gets a job and moves out. So there is a connection to the world of work. Our kids do have to be productive citizens, but that doesn't have to be in the traditional forms that we know, as people were saying. Kids are going to take jobs that we have never even heard of before, and that's great. So I want them to be prepared for that, whatever it is. It's not job training, it's life readiness. And I think those two things are not incompatible.